And at one point, one of the agency owners said, look, I just want to be famous. How do I become famous? Does anybody have any advice? And
that's so authentic. Good for them for just owning that.
Yes. And howdy. Welcome to the Future of Content. I'm your host, Todd Ross-Nienkerk. I don't normally start an episode with a bunch of statistics, but these are pretty compelling and I just can't help myself. According to the 2024 Edelman LinkedIn Thought Leadership Impact Report, 73% of decision makers say thought leadership content is more trustworthy than marketing materials and product sheets. 90% of decision makers and executives are more receptive to outreach from an organization that consistently produces high-quality thought leadership. 70% of executives say that a piece of thought leadership has led them to question whether they should continue working with an existing supplier. And despite all of that, 30% of producers of thought leadership say their organization does not really know how to use thought leadership as a marketing tool. The numbers don't lie. Thought leadership is effective. It's also misunderstood. To me, thought leadership sometimes feels like synergy or ROI, important and sometimes transformative concepts that get said so often they risk becoming meaningless or worse, ridiculed as buzzwords or corporate speak. But thought leadership is unique. It's different from expertise. And creating thought leadership content requires skills that transcend writing, editing, and even design. And it's not limited to articles or social media posts. According to today's guest, thought leadership happens everywhere with every email, video call, and staff meeting. Lyz Nagan is a ghostwriter and editor who helps executives craft their thought leadership practice. She helps them ideate, then brings their point of view and expertise to life in books, articles, newsletters, presentations, blogs, and social posts. In our conversation, Lyz and I discuss what it takes to stand out as a thought leader, why having a unique perspective matters in a crowded market, and how to avoid the pitfalls of empty thought leadership that lacks substance. We also touch on the challenges executives face when producing meaningful content and the strategies Lyz uses to make thought leadership sustainable and impactful. We pick up the conversation when I asked Lyz to explain what thought leadership means and how it's different from expertise. So you specialize in ghostwriting thought leadership for executives. So there's a lot to unpack in all of that. I guess first we should probably establish the thought leadership portion of things. So what to you is thought leadership, and how is thought leadership different from something like, say, expertise?
Yeah, so for me, thought leadership content is different from other forms of content in that it really leads with ideas and insights over information. So you're going to hear a stronger point of view, they're not necessarily always controversial opinions, but they're opinions and they're strong opinions. They are stories and experiences, so it requires sometimes a level of vulnerability and authenticity, always authenticity from the thought leader. And I think that level of personality and person in the content is what makes it really different than, say, content marketing or other forms of blogging about your product or service, which is, again, kind of a form of content marketing. And I think what also makes good thought leadership is when it really can impact people, like when you are leaning on stories, experiences, ideas that are really kind of pushing for something to be better, something to change, something to spark in your audience a new way of thinking or doing. So it's not just content for content's sake. It's really about kind of driving a little bit of momentum or challenging the status quo.
So in other words, content that isn't necessarily we have a product, we have a service. I want to tell you about the product. I want to tell you about the service. Here are the features. Here's the functionality. Here are a bunch of keywords so that we rank.
Yes.
Instead, it's we have this perspective, or I have this perspective. We have an opinion about something. We are opinionated. We think things should be done a certain way. We have an idea. We have a philosophy, and here it is. And it may not necessarily contain a lot of keywords or product information or things like that, but instead it's kind of like staking a claim to an idea or a philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting, the Edelman and LinkedIn do a thought leadership, like B2B thought leadership sort of survey and report every year. And I just found their 2024 one. I think it may have been out now for a few months, but and what you're saying around like SEO and keywords, the effectiveness of thought leadership actually relies on not using a lot of those marketing tactics, and because it drives more trust in the message itself. So not only is it not that kind of content, it actually probably shouldn't be that kind of content. And
is that because it doesn't read as authentic, or because people sort of have an expectation that that's going to be selling them more directly or something?
I don't know. It doesn't get into that because it's just it was a survey, but I suspect it's the authenticity. I think people, when people read a piece of thought leadership, or what they come to think of as, when you get into something, you don't always know if it's thought leadership or marketing or what the angle is. But once you start to read something where someone is putting their ideas on the line, or even a company is putting their perspective kind of out there and staking a claim, like you said, if it's loaded with buzzwords or SEO, keywords, things that aren't kind of authentic to a voice of what a human or a human-centered company would use, it's just going to read as like, I think A, it's not authentic, but also B, it's just not interesting to read oftentimes. Yeah. Which, unless you're really just looking for instruction, that loading with reading a piece with a bunch of SEO and keywords is just not going to be that compelling. Yeah. Unless I'm trying to unclog my sink, and then it can use all the keywords about home plumbing it wants. Because I just want to unclog my sink.
Yeah, it's instructional. It's instructional, and you're trying to inform and educate, which actually brings me to a LinkedIn post that you published a while back, where you were trying to differentiate between expertise and thought leadership, where you listed some criteria, some differentiating factors, characteristics between experts and expertise, and thought leaders and thought leadership. And that expertise is characterized by being informational and educational, that it advances knowledge, that it objectively sticks to facts, digs into details, whereas thought leadership goes further, and it is really intended to motivate and inspire, to have a thoughtful perspective, to be driven by purpose, to show personality, subjectivity, authenticity, share new ideas and insights. And that where a expertise or expert piece of content is would leave you thinking, I know more now. I'm more educated now. A thought leadership piece will hopefully make you say, I think differently now. So it's the difference between knowing and thinking.
Yeah, and I'm such a strong believer in that distinction, which and neither is better than the other. Like, we need both. Like, we need experts, we need thought leaders, we need people to help us, make sense of how things are now, and we need people to help us explore new ways of being and thinking. And I think, and the reason I differentiate is because I just think there's so much content out there that is expertise driven, that wants to kind of get the traction or have the effect of thought leadership, and it just doesn't get there. So I think just a lot of the people who are putting out playbooks and frameworks and are kind of constantly just I shouldn't say just, because instructing is very helpful. I need instruction in a lot of things in my life. But to me, you can't kind of ascend to the level of somebody who you might want to ascend to, like Simon Sinek or Brene Brown, if you are just sort of sticking to the educational and instructional and detail-oriented and objective-oriented content. But you could aspire, but you can also get a lot from that path, that sort of content path too. You might have form a great foundation for a business, or a repeatable, scalable kind of playbook that you can franchise, but that's different than being seen as somebody who that organization wants to hire to come and do a keynote speak to inspire their 10,000 employees because you're so good at helping people shift from perspective A to perspective B.
That actually raises a question that I wanted to pose to you. Why would somebody want to become a thought leader as opposed to an expert in this definition, in this paradigm?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I think there's like a cringy element. Like, I don't think anyone like wants to become a thought leader. Like, no one that I work with or speak to, that's not the goal. The goal is that something bigger. It's their purpose. It's because they see so many people who do it this way and are getting frustrated. So they really want to share their message of doing it that way, whatever that shift is. So they're not driven to become a thought leader. I think they're just driven by a deeper purpose, which is one of my kind of core tenets of how I construct sort of a thought leadership practice with clients, which is purpose, perspective, and personality. So all that being said, I feel like saying I want to become a thought leader is like saying I want to become an influencer. Like, it's cringy, and you're like, and you're not even one. Like, can you even like name yourself as one of those things? Like, isn't it your effect that sort of bestows the title on you? So all to say, right, I don't think people, So I don't think people like aspire to do that. I think that people who are going to become really good thought leaders have a higher purpose, and people who are experts might have a higher purpose, but a lot of times that purpose is about sort of educating and kind of investigating, not exploring, like a kind of a wide open space.
Yeah. It's, in other words, thought leadership becomes, it's a means to an end. It's a vehicle. Yes.
It's a path. It's a strategy, if you will. I mean, and yeah, I think that's what I'd call it.
What's interesting is you say that, but I had a moment a few years ago where I went to one of these conferences for other agency owners and leaders. And towards the end of the conference, it's the last session of the day where they basically throw the agenda out the window and they say, all right, here's the hour where you can talk about anything you want. You can ask any kind of question you want. Nothing's off limits. And at one point, one of the agency owners said, look, I just want to be famous. How do I become famous? Does anybody have any advice? And
that's so authentic. Good for them for just owning that.
Yes, and some people had some advice, and that moment really sticks out to me for all kinds of reasons. For that reason, because they're being so authentic to themselves and what they want. Also, because there's also, to me, there's a little bit of a cringiness to that, because that's not something I personally seek, but also good for them. And I also, knowing them and their agency and their former business partnership, and knowing that their business partner did become famous through expertise, became really well known, wrote a lot of books, expertise driven books, not thought leadership driven books, that maybe there was a feeling of, well, why can't I be that too? Maybe, or I want that too, or something. Maybe there was some feeling there. So sometimes people do just want that. Sometimes people do just want the journey and not necessarily the destination. So
Yeah, I mean,
one way to do it.
Their therapists might say that there's probably deeper reasons for wanting to be famous, that could align with something kind of higher or more psychological. But
yeah, that's right.
I do think. I do think that. I mean, I was kind of toying when I was thinking, and when I do think about expert versus thought leader, I do wonder if you could become a great thought leader just because you want to be famous or to be well known or to have a huge audience. Like if you just want impressions and reach, is that enough motivation? Like, could you be really good at that, at thought leadership, if that is your purpose? And I guess
if that's the end,
I
is that enough to make you genuinely good at it?
Yeah, because then what would you talk about? Like, you still have to be deeply interested in something else, like some idea that you are interested in enough to explore,
and authentically,
right? And authentically
interested.
Yeah. So I'm not saying
if
they're
you were
mutually
authentically
exclusive.
Interested in being famous, then maybe you can be a thought leader in becoming famous.
Right. I was going to say, once you started that journey, you could become quite maybe well known or recognized as the person who charted your journey from, nobody to somebody, which could be a very interesting memoir. And if again, you'd have to.
I feel like that industry exists, and I feel like they are on a lot of basic cable shows and streaming shows. So I think that that's a real thing.
It is, but not one we normally associate with thought leadership. So I don't know.
That's true. I feel like we associate it with a lot of clothing lines and
right.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm always interested in my ideas being challenged and proven otherwise. So if anyone who's listening has any examples, happy to take them and kind of put them in my storage bank of knowledge.
Well, let's move on to ghostwriting, which is the second half of this. So thought leadership for executives and ghostwriting.
Mm-hmm.
What is your process for ghostwriting, and what kinds of ghostwriting do you specialize in?
Well, I'll start with what kinds first, because that does the type influences a little bit of the how. So because I work primarily with executives, the suite or sort of the ecosystem of what I work on are speeches, keynotes, blog posts, articles, books, ebooks, handbooks, all the books. And then often once I've been working with a client for a period of time, I also get privy to sort of a level of like internal communications or executive communications that they decide they want to have sort of more like just develop in a more credible, robust way. So that could include, presentations for town halls, internal newsletters that CEOs might be, emailing out to their either C-suite or leadership team or sometimes all employees. So it kind of can bridge internal comms and sort of executive comms and then more public facing. And I also do some scripting and prepping for podcasts or video sort of interviews, public, live interviews, if they have TV engagements, all of that. So in some ways, my role working with executives is ghostwriting. It's putting words to paper, but it's also, metaphorical paper these days, but it's also being a thought partner. It's saying, it's really working with them on developing clarity and consistency and kind of challenging them to make sure they're going far enough or going in the right direction, thinking about opportunities, but also risks. And so that all comes into play with all of that, with all of the types of content. And then, of course, the words. So the process that, for each client can be different. I'd say, I really work with clients to figure out how they work. I sort of plug into their or natural way of expressing themselves. I'd say more than not, my clients have either no time, they have the skill for writing, but no time to write, or don't have a skill for writing, but have great ideas. So depending on the path, whether they love to write, but just don't have the time or not, I work with them a little differently. It comes down to a lot of conversations, a lot of voice memos back and forth, a lot of, I work asynchronously. So because everyone's busy, not everyone can jump on a 2-hour Zoom call for me to interview them about a chapter of a book. So I assign homeworks and prompts, and then we kind of work back and forth to fine tune whatever it is that deliverable is. Voice memos have become probably the primary way that my clients communicate with me, communicate their ideas. I guess verbal is just a more natural, oftentimes it is more natural for people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that because, is that a logistic thing where people just squeeze it into the spare moments that they have, or is it more natural because they can do it when they're alone and they don't feel like they have these awkward silences while somebody kind of sits there and waits for them to talk while they're thinking? Or why does that become the primary medium?
I think there's the ability for it to be asynchronous is just convenient, but I think verbalizing over, say, responding to an email or writing out their thoughts, there's just fewer obstacles. I mean, people get, the writer's block, even sometimes writing a short email to a client, or what have you. So yeah. I think it's less that it's discomfort with me sitting sort of across from them on a Zoom call or a recording, and more that we have great ideas and all times of the day, as we know, like the shower, the infamous, like, great idea in the shower or out for a walk. And that's so I get a voice memo from a client that's like, oh, I think I nailed the final point on that one speech. I think this is going to, blah, 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 blah. And they kind of tell me about it. And then I can say, oh, okay, so then I can work in that theme. I'll introduce it a little earlier. We can kind of, work on it from there. So it's just become like a very easy back and forth. And again, I just don't think people want to sit for a couple hours and work on one thing, even though I do, which is why I take the brunt of the sitting and concentrating on the production work. That's like my ideal afternoon is, sitting and going heads down and writing something. But that's just going heads down and that deep is not how everyone, can.
Do you think
work.
that voice notes, sporadic bits of attention, shower thoughts on a walk kind of workflow is more unique to your executive clientele, or is that, no, you think so?
It is. I think there's a few, I'll say that some of my clients have openly shared their neurodivergence or different sort of diagnoses with me. So I think there's just an element of, and we know this, entrepreneurs, frequently I'm working with entrepreneurs and like visionary style people, even if they aren't entrepreneurs, they might be kind of a visionary role inside of an organization. And people with that talent often have some kind of special neurodivergence that gives them the absolute asset in that seat, but obviously a little harder for them to just sit down and get their ideas out in a really cohesive flow. And they're often busier. So I'm working now on a project that is a little bit outside of this scope, which is a family legacy book. And my client, yes. My clients are much more involved. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And they are much more involved in a more written and sit down, have a meeting, have a conversation way. So I do think it's kind of special to executives based on a lot of facets of the realities, I should say, of their role and skills.
And this family legacy project does not involve an executive.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And it's a noticeably different style of work.
Very, very noticeably, which
really?
is super interesting to work with, or to just see the difference in how they kind of want to work together. And I'm very adaptable. It's been so I enjoy changing gears and finding new ways to work with people, because I think it only strengthens my skills. B, it keeps things a little interesting. C, it'll just make a better project if I can adapt to them rather than forcing them to adapt to me. So it's been really interesting.
The neurotype point that you raise about executives is interesting to me. I mean, being an executive myself and being by definition an entrepreneur myself, and I always feel strange using that word because I feel like that word usually has the word serial attached to it for some reason. Otherwise, people don't even use that word at all. And I love that we're getting to use cringy a lot in this podcast, but boy, that one I really cringe out on that one. Serial entrepreneur. Yeah. Sorry if anybody listening calls themselves that, but I mean, please stop.
Yeah. Please.
Please just don't. I don't think that I personally would fall into any of those categories in terms of a diagnosis. Mm-hmm. But I certainly do identify in terms of behaviors and certain deficiencies, I suppose, in well, I forget the name of the we do a lot of like testing at Four Kitchens, not personality testing. That's not the right word, but
like Strength Finder kind of thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. People DNA, Strength Finder, all of those. Right. Yeah. And those are not intended to somehow categorize your personality. They're intended to better identify what comes naturally to you, what does not come naturally to you, where your strengths are, where your strengths aren't. And I rank very low on what's called reality testing.
What does that mean? Reality, like
what that means?
Are your head in the clouds, or
sort of. It means that I'm really good at convincing other people, and myself, that something is true, even if it's not. And I'm not good at testing if that thing is real. So that doesn't mean in the sense of, the sky is pink, like not that kind of reality testing, but that an idea for a product or service is a good idea because, well, it seems like it should be a good idea, and here are all the reasons why, and I get really excited about it, or I have this initiative that I want to do, and I all the enthusiasm in the world gets behind it, and I talk myself into it, and I talk other people into it, and I need people around me who are good reality testers to stop and think, well, let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the market. Let's look at whether or not this actually is a good idea before we spend months and months pursuing this, or a lot of money pursuing this idea, or whatever. And that kind of pattern is something that's also common among entrepreneurs and executives, because you have to, in a way, ignore reality. Otherwise, you would be terrified.
And you have to help others ignore reality, because
that's right.
You're, especially in the field of technology, there's so much that's innovation based or future thinking based in order to be successful, or even like, I mean, just table stakes almost. So,
well, now I'm focused on this. Now I'm interested in that. And now I want to do this thing. And so it's this, I love the idea of voice memos, because then, well, now I want to spend 15 minutes thinking about this thing, and I don't want to talk about that anymore. I want to go do that. And I completely understand having to squeeze in these thoughts about a speech or a keynote in between these 15-minute meetings and that Slack conversation and this podcast recording. And I totally get that. It would be very hard for me to try to find 2 or 3 hours to sit down and do a deep dive into anything.
Yeah. And I mean, a good ghostwriter will be really good at connecting dots. That's most of, I mean, another LinkedIn post that I posted recently was like, being a writer is like one of the last things I actually think of when I think of my job, even though I write thousands of words a day sometimes. And it's because there's so much other kind of skill and type of thinking that goes into being a ghostwriter that doesn't have to do with writing, like connecting dots. So, for example, as clients send 4 ideas, all that they think kind of falls under an umbrella for a particular talk or speech, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, well, these 3 might be obvious. This one's a little outlier. What's the story? And I'm trying to thread everything together to make the impact that they want to make. And that, everything doesn't always make the cut, of course. But that's the challenge for me, is the dot connecting, even then between different deliverables, right? So if I'm working on a speech here and then they share an upcoming interview that they're doing, and they want to prep for it. And then we've been working on a blog post, and it's like, all of a sudden I'm seeing this theme. You're kind of talking about different things, but actually these are kind of laddering up to this new idea that maybe we didn't even know you were tapping into, because we were focused on this talk or this interview. But I think there's something new here. Like, let's talk about that maybe after we finish these other things. So that sort of pattern identification, dot connecting, is, I think, like something I end up doing more, and I identify more with it because I'm kind of a problem solver type. So that's like, when I think of my job, I think, oh, that's what I'm doing. And I happen to be writing, yeah. which is just like a byproduct of what I'm actually doing for clients.
How else has your process changed over time? How do you feel about some of these emerging technologies like AI, the role that plays in your process, in your clients' processes?
Well, definitely as someone in the kind of writing world, who follows other people in the writing world on LinkedIn, the AI conversation is an ongoing theme, probably for everyone's industry, but for ours, it's basically, is it going to replace us? And I think it might replace some, although that's a less interesting conversation to me. And it's more like, how can we work with it? And I think there's great ways and really low hanging fruit ways that I work with it now, like transcriptions. I mean, an obvious, right? Like, I'm not going to have a 2-hour interview that I sit and transcribe. And I don't need it to be, say pixel perfect or period perfect, because I'm going to be working with it. It's just the clay that I'm going to mold, right? So that is a super easy and very convenient and efficient tool. Some of the image making, sort of generative AI, I have used for different deliverables, like blog posts, like the imagery that we have to use or create to kind of like populate newsletters, reports, that kind of thing. I easily and comfortably use it for that. I also easily and comfortably use it for like summary making. So if I have a long conversation with a client where we kind of touch on a range of topics, because it's a bit of maybe more of a meandering conversation, or we go down some different little rabbit holes, I can easily extrapolate or use a program to extrapolate some of the key ideas. And it's great because then I can go back to the transcript and be like, right, where did we talk about this one? Where did we talk about this one? So those are all like great tools. Where I've seen my clients using them and making it actually much harder for me, I think is I know that it's making it harder for me, and I think they think it's making it easier for me. But I have clients who will start kind of like a research-based exploration by using an AI tool. I'm going to say ChatGPT. I don't actually know which one they're always using, but for the sake of some not just for the sake of specificity, I'll say that.
Mhm.
So they start a whole conversation and sort of inquiry with ChatGPT, and I get this kind of output of stuff that is a mix between research, like data points, and content. I just got one from a client. There were 10 data points that they shared. They said, these are the 10 references that their AI gave them to support this small bit of content that they had sent me. I went and found all of those references, and 8 of 10 were not correct at all. Like what the AI said, they literally didn't say at all, or it was completely removed from context and not ethical to recreate the other context. And so that's an example of a time when I thought I could have just found data points for these, but instead I had to go and look up these 10, read through. One of them was a 48-page academic paper, which I had to read because I had to see if it said this one thing. Because I have a strong standard of excellence, and I would not let any of my clients go out with some poorly researched or poorly cited content.
Yeah.
But it makes it really hard for me when it's that unstable and unpredictable as a source. So, and oddly, so that's like the kind of more reference citation side of things. Oddly, editing AI written content is really hard because it does some wonky stuff sometimes to sentences, and you're like,
yes,
it's like,
yes.
My brain hurts, but I'm not even thinking that hard, but somehow this is like,
I know,
so messy.
Okay, I'm not alone. I felt the same way. It's harder to edit AI stuff than it is human stuff, and I can't put my finger on why.
Yeah, poorly written human stuff is way easier to edit than poorly written AI stuff. And I agree with you. I should try to figure out why, as someone who does edit quite a bit, because it literally something in my brain can't work with it. And I'm not even adverse to the idea of it. Like, I mean, I'm not so opposed to AI that I'm like, heck no. It's like, I'm open to its possibilities, but man, so far what I've seen is just really hard to work with.
Yeah. So I'll admit that part of the production process we use for this podcast involves using AI to transcribe the episodes, obviously.
Yeah.
And then we use AI to create the first drafts of episode show notes and the blog posts that accompany each episode. And then I personally edit those show notes and the blog posts. And I always kind of dread editing the blog post because it feels like I have to kick into a higher gear editing that than, and I have a background in writing and editing. We started as a publishing company. Like, this is something that I should really be able to do. And I suspect that it's because it's like closer, it gets a little closer to good than maybe a poorly written human draft. And so it's like it's firmer, it's a little more cooked. And so it's harder to break apart and put back together. You have to like disassemble it more to reassemble it into a thing that you want, because it has an opinionated tone. And to put it back in your tone, you just have to pull it apart more. You have to strip it further into its base parts. I think that's, for me, at least that's what I have to do with it. I find myself gutting it deeper than if a person wrote it.
Yeah, I
just feel like I'm rewriting it.
Right. I mean, and it does, it does help you bypass the dreaded, blank page.
Yes.
Which is something. But I do find that when I'm editing AI, I essentially hard return, and then my cursor's above it, and I read the first sentence, and I'm like, what is it really saying? And then
Yes.
I just type it
And you
how
just
I
rewrite. Yes,
would
you
just
just
say
rewrite.
it, or how my client, or with the voice and tone that I'm trying to create.
Yes.
And then I go to the second sentence, and obviously it's not quite that sentence by sentence, but it's more, but you get what I'm saying. So I'm just
Yes.
redoing it,
Yes.
versus line editing where I'm like, oh, this word, okay, we just need to rearrange this sentence. It's like, nope,
Yeah.
we're rewriting. Thank you, AI, for getting us here, but it's all new.
Yeah. I've also noticed that with some tools, not all tools, but some LLMs will shift POV mid article and it will repeat ideas. And you have to really find where it's doing that. For example, with these podcast blog posts, it will shift from some version of a first person I guess it's me personally, Todd.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking with Lyz, and I said this, and Lyz said that. Then it sort of shifts to Todd said this, and this episode is about that. And in this episode, they discuss.
Yeah.
And you have to really catch it because it sneaks up on you, and you're like, wait a second, we just shifted to third person, and now I have to rewrite it. Like, what am I going to? You have to remind
then you
yourself.
Have to choose. Then you're like, go to the paragraph above. And you're like, what was I writing?
Yes, exactly.
And then,
wait, how am I writing all of these? Now I'm confused. Yeah. And I have to go back and look at old blog posts and remember, have I always written them in first person or has it always been in third person?
Yeah. Yep.
Yes. So you have to sometimes prompt that specifically. And then the repetition of ideas, it'll kind of randomly throw in an idea from the first paragraph and the fourth paragraph, and it'll restate it. And you're like, that seems oddly familiar. And you have to go back and catch it. And you have to I find you have to read it like 3 or 4 times all the way through and realize, oh, it already said that. Yeah. Let's end with this. We talked about how thought leaders need to have a clear perspective or point of view. Mm-hmm. And I had mentioned an episode of a podcast that I listen to called Two Bobs, which is a podcast for agency owners and leaders. And they talk a lot about positioning, among many other things, about how to run a successful agency. But positioning is something that they come back to time and time again, and differentiation and creating as small a viable market as you possibly can, which is also a Seth Godin idea. You're not supposed to appeal to as many people as possible. You're supposed to appeal to as few people as possible to sustain your business. And that's how you create a successful business. And this idea of creating a perspective, a strong, opinionated perspective, is one way to differentiate your organization in the marketplace. And I found it interesting that you were also in your LinkedIn post talking about how thought leadership is in part about having an opinion and creating a perspective or a point of view. So I'm curious how you feel that plays a role in creating a personal brand or an organization's brand, how that starts to overlap with marketing and positioning, and how thought leadership plays a role in branding and marketing and positioning and all of that.
Yeah. Well, I have a few thoughts that I hope that connect to each other. But one, I think kind of you shared what you had heard, and I agree. I think a strong point of view either draws people in or repels people, right? People are either compelled and taken and want to know more, or think that I want to know more, or I want to work with someone like that. Like, that is a really cool way of thinking. That's never even occurred to me. Or you hear another way of working from somebody else who has a strong opinion, and you think, oh gosh, hell no. Like that is just doesn't align with who I am, my values, and that is a perfect, like sort of client chooser, right? Like people, you only want people who align with you. You only want people who are going to want to work the way you work. Because if you start and you decide, halfway through the project, you realize, oh, they're not going to be transparent, but we said we were transparent, that's going to cause some real issues with the success or sort of success of the relationship, success of the project. So you want people who identify with you to come back, and you want people who don't identify with you to go somewhere else. So I think the strong point of view is an early vetting tool, right? I mean, they can opt in or opt out because they know exactly who you are, either as an individual or a brand up front. We know Patagonia's values, and you probably aren't going to be somebody who disagrees vehemently with their strong perspective and think, oh, I'm going to have a happy and long career there, or I'm going to be a vendor partner and behave in a very different way or express really different points of view. So I think right away you just it's a vetting tool. And businesses, or can use it, I think hugely to their benefit. In fact, the Edelman study, which I'm going to reference again. So from like an kind of vendor or agency perspective, there was some statistic in here that shared that a client who saw good quality thought leadership content from a prospective vendor was like 76% more likely to ask them for an RFP, like to reach out and say, hey, do you want to put your hat in the ring for this? Which, I mean, just from a sort of business perspective and kind of where it dovetails with, or thought leadership dovetails with marketing or sales, that's like an incredible overlap. And now I want to check that the percentage because 86% of decision makers also say they would be moderately or very likely to invite them to participate in the RFP process if they read high quality thought leadership content from a company. 86%. That's a really high, percentage. And, whether that actually happens in real life, this is of course a survey, but I do think the sentiment is probably pretty true, if not the number itself.
Yeah. And any indication if it's something that they agree with, or is it just that they say, oh, they have an opinion?
It says 9 in 10 of say they are moderately or very likely to be more receptive to sales or marketing outreach from a company that consistently produces high quality thought leadership. And I think high quality is probably the key phrase there. So I'm guessing that it's less about whether they agree or not and more about how sort of substantiated, how clear, how relevant that content is. Having a strong point of view alone is like not enough to be credible and high quality. You also need to be able to back that up to whether that's through research or stories or experience or, however you're sharing that. I think that is what kind of brings it to that high quality level. And even if someone doesn't agree, it will make them think more if you have other elements of high quality content within your strong perspective. So it's not about being like a provocateur or sort of a kind of contrarian necessarily, but it's about taking a stance and really believing in it and then communicating it convincingly and credibly. And it's hard to disregard. Even if you disagree, it's hard to disregard content like that.
Wonderful. Well, I'll do
come at me if you disagree.